Hi, welcome to my YouTube channel, Torture History. Today we are going to about inhuman practices of Victorian wedding night. Why Victorian ladies were scared of their wedding. Today we are going to check that, the reason behind. Imagine a wedding night where neither party had any idea how the mechanics of sex function. Imagine a new bride so terrified of the rude action her husband tried to commit, she runs home to her parents and asks for an annulment the next day. Imagine a woman going into labor and truly believing that the infant was about to exit her body via the belly button. These terrifying circumstances where women had no reproductive or sexual knowledge prior to real-life experience were all a reality, according to Roy Porter and Leslie Hall in The Facts of Life. Creation of Sexual Knowledge in Britain, Chapter 11. How was this possible? The following exhibit will begin by discussing the sexual attitudes of Victorian England, and then discuss the various sex manuals which existed to prevent the above scenarios from occurring. The unfortunate and educated mentioned above were largely middle-class people, so the exhibit will focus on the education of middle-class Victorians throughout the period, mainly exploring how women were prepared for their wedding night. In the modern lexicon, Victorian is used as an adjective to describe frigid or prudish attitudes. Everyone has heard the tales of Victorian sexual repression, like covered table and piano legs, lest the curvy shape of the furniture remind viewers of a woman's body. Perhaps the most cited example of Victorian prudishness is the legend of Queen Victoria telling her daughter to lie back and think of England on her wedding night. This second example perhaps points not at the prudishness of the time, but a larger problem. Discussion of sex was so taboo that many went uneducated about the topic of sex, down to the simple physical mechanics of the act, until their first experience, sometimes, but not always, on their wedding night. Victorians were absolutely having sex out of wedlock, especially in the upper and lower classes. The bourgeoisie were especially open about this fact, documenting their sexual escapades in letters and diaries, said Helena Michie in her book Victorian Honeymoons, 110. According to Jennifer Fegley in her book Courtship and Marriage in Victorian England, working-class people were having sex before marriage, as well, to the point that a premarital pregnancy was seen in some circles as a way to secure a husband. 59. The middle-class population seemed to be the section of Victorian England most responsible for the prudish impression held by modern users of the adjective Victorian. In Victorian England, a woman was expected to be a virgin on her wedding day. Sex was thought of as a way for married couples to spiritually bond and procreate. Sex without the possibility of procreation was considered sinful, and the topic of contraception was extremely taboo. Melody 21. While the bride was expected to be pure on her wedding night, it was understood that her new husband, especially if he was rich or working class, would probably have sexual experience by the way of prostitution. Michie 25. By the late 1700s, over 10,000 prostitutes worked the London streets, Porter 22, spreading disease and sexual knowledge. Even if each woman serviced only one man every day, the numbers are still pretty impressive. While all of these men were learning about sex through the unrealistic and performative veil of prostitution, their middle-class brides-to-be were largely blissfully unaware of the sexual nature of marriage or the mechanics of their reproductive health. Women were marrying in their early 20s, Fegley 36, meaning that full-grown women didn't understand where babies came from. My research explores how these women learned what was up with their bodies. Where did Victorian middle-class women learn about their wifely duties and the reproductive structures of their own anatomies? In short, my findings showed that women learned mostly through experience in the marriage bed. Victorian honeymoons were very different than the tropical vacations that may come to mind today. Following a long engagement, but not too long, as that may encourage extramarital sex, newlyweds would honeymoon for periods of time from 2 weeks to 3 months in what was very often the first time the couple had ever spent alone together. Privacy was never afforded to a courting couple. Michie's above-mentioned book was researched by reading the honeymoon diaries and correspondence of 60 newly married couples, 39. In this entire body of research, only a handful of allusions to sexual activity exist, 43. This fact is probably due to several reasons. First, the woman writing about her honeymoon would not have felt comfortable divulging intimate details to even her diary. Sex was not a proper subject, and she would have been conditioned to regard it as taboo. Also, the honeymoon was about more than the introduction of their sexual life as a married couple. This trip transformed them from virtual strangers who had never spent time alone together to husband and wife. Novelist Charles Kingsley and his wife waited an entire month after their wedding to consummate, allowing the time to become comfortable with one another. This method seems to have been successful, as Fegley cites evidence in their letters of a hot sex life afterward, 140. Probably less commonly, some marriages would not have been consummated due to ill-informed spouses. English poet John Addington Symonds remembers his honeymoon and how it was affected by sex education. Society does all that lies in us to keep them chaste, to develop and refine their sense of shame, while we leave them to imagine what they like about nuptial connection. Then we fling them naked in bed together, modest, alike ignorant, mutually embarrassed by the awkward situation, trusting that they will blunder to truth by instinct, QTD. In Michie 79, he goes on to say that this ill-informed wedding night only hurts the relationship by causing the couple to start their marriage with shame and confusion instead of joy. This initial shame would surely hurt the end goal of bonding the couple spiritually through sex. Regardless, misinformation and confusion are both words easily associated with sexual knowledge in this period, no matter the marital status. You can't get pregnant if you're not married, and other sexual misinformation. Sexual knowledge in the hands of unmarried people was seen as dangerous. Those children, or, in the case of an unmarried woman in her parents' home, adults, who learned too much about sex were seen as at risk for participating in deviant premarital relations. Having incomplete information on a subject is worse than having no information at all. While young boys may have understood the mechanics of sex and where to purchase sexual experiences, they didn't know about the prevalence of STDs, which spread so widely that genital cauterization was seen as a viable way to keep the viruses and infections in check. Misinformation abounded among the undereducated. It was common belief, for example, that STDs could be passed through towels, water fountains and common eating utensils, meaning that philandering husbands didn't have to explain where they picked up the clap. Sinful sex, mainly sex out of wedlock, was thought to be procreatively unproductive, which is obviously wildly untrue. The misinformation didn't stop at rumor though. Sex manuals of the time also propagated incorrect ideas as fact. One writer, Henry Hanchett, who will be discussed in detail later, wrote that vicarious menstruation was possible, where the egg was expelled through the nose, lungs or some other place. It was commonly written that women only submitted to their husband's sexual desires because they wanted to be mothers, not because they had any sexual desires themselves in. This spread of misinformation led to a lot of confused people, some with damaged health. Not all sex manuals were so misinformed, but most depicted sexuality in a less than honest way. The earliest sex manual that would have been available to Victorian audiences is the anonymously published Aristotle's Masterpiece, or Directory for Midwives. This 1684 manual was not by Aristotle and was not a masterpiece. In fact, it was just a compilation of various uncredited sources, Porter 33-6. The name Aristotle was chosen to lend an air of expertise and wisdom, which may have worked, since this manual circulated for over 100 years after its initial publication, 43, 47, 37. The third edition is the one most likely to have been read by Victorian audiences. It was bawdy and irreverent, giving advice like, "But if she is ugly, the advice is, do it in the dark, QTD." In Porter 38, which probably accounts for teen boys passing this book around like a Playboy. It's important to recognize that teen boys are the only children that my research cited as reading the manual. Content of the manual. Aristotle agreed with the notion that female sexual pleasure is solely derived from the idea that a child may be conceived, But he takes this idea a step further. Women may have even greater sexual satisfaction and pleasure than men because of their desire for motherhood. Melody 46. Aristotle also recognizes the clitoris as an analogous structure to the penis as far as pleasure is concerned. 46. The authors of Masterpiece acknowledged that a missing hymen does not necessarily indicate missing virginity. Fisnell 63. A fact that would save many innocent girls from the wrath of the men in their life. This manual focuses, as many did, solely on reproductive, heterosexual intercourse. Porter 42. Unlike Victorian custom though, this manual encouraged marriage soon after puberty to make sure women took advantage of their full span of reproductive years. 43. Aristotle said that finding the correct balance of sexual frequency was crucial. They that would be commended for their wedlock actions, and be happy in the fruit of their labor, must observe to copulate at distance of time, not too often, nor yet too seldom, for both these hurt fruitfulness alike. Overall, Aristotle's ideas were socially advanced. While he discouraged sex out of wedlock, he understood female pleasure more than most. Manuals of the early 20th century were a little more mindful towards the happiness and sexual health of females. Misinformation was still prevalent. It was commonly noted in these manuals that anything less than simultaneous orgasm during intercourse was not agreeable. Women were given the right to refuse sex if their husband could not achieve the orgasm of the woman and the ejaculation of semen of the man in the same instant. This circumstance is obviously difficult to achieve for even experienced partners, so this expectation surely set some relationships up for failure from the beginning. Isabel Hutton called this act of simultaneous orgasm, mutual adjustment, in her 1923 manual The Hygiene of Marriage. While manuals were encouraging this perhaps impossible to achieve goal to inexperienced partners, they also admitted that first sexual couplings between married people may be awkward, but practice should allow them to learn each other's bodies. Married Love by Marie Stopes was perhaps the most honest and controversial manual of the day. Published in several editions and volumes in the early 1900s, the manual encouraged mutual sexual satisfaction. She was also a huge proponent of birth control and sexual experimentation. Stopes was discredited as a wanton woman, but her honesty gained many fans. Soldiers were known to gift this manual to their fiancés, so the uneducated women would be prepared once their husband to be returned from war. Stopes said that the men who visited prostitutes and their frigid wives were the product of their society, which made sexual knowledge and experience taboo. Since men were likely to have been with a prostitute prior to their wedding night, they would find their wife's inexperience off-putting. She acknowledged that the inexperience was so extensive that women may actually be shocked by their new husband's physical expectations and refuse to participate. While the women to which Stopes is referring were not even born in the Victorian period, they were absolutely affected by the sexual education practices of the time. Since their mothers were uneducated, these modern women did not have any way to learn about sex. It was very much a chain reaction. Parents felt their daughters should learn about sex the way they did, on the wedding night. Even mothers who wanted to explain sex to their daughters were so uneducated and shy that proper explanation was impossible. One letter from the time documents a mother telling her daughter on the eve of the daughter's wedding, "There are certain things your husband will require from you. It's not nice and you'll just have to put up with it," which is petrifying advice to hear when you are about to be alone with a man for the first time. Modern women's young married friends were even often too ashamed to tell unmarried women of what would be expected by husbands. Lack of sex education for brides. Middle and upper-class Victorian society strongly enforced the ideal of the angel in the house, a woman who was sexually pure, submissive, and domestic. Widespread misinformation. Due to the taboo nature of sex, many women were left completely ignorant about the mechanics of sexual intercourse and reproduction. Terrified brides. This ignorance, compounded by a societal expectation that women had little sexual desire, caused many brides to enter their wedding night with fear or hysteria. Think of England. The legendary advice, "Lie back and think of England," though apocryphal for Queen Victoria, reflects the actual mindset of the period, where many women were told to simply endure marital sex as a duty. Marriage manuals. A letter from the time, noted in historical sources, records a mother telling her daughter on the eve of her wedding, "There are certain things your husband will require from you. It's not nice and you'll just have to put up with it." Sexual double standard. A stark disparity existed between male and female sexual expectations, often making the wedding night a fraught encounter. Husbands with experience. It was widely accepted that husbands, particularly in the upper and working classes, would have had sexual experience through interactions with prostitutes before marriage. Prostitution widespread. Prostitution flourished during the Victorian era, even as society publicly upheld a moralistic facade. The Contagious Diseases Acts of the 1860s, which punished female prostitutes but not their male clients, further cemented this sexual double standard in law. Mutual incompatibility. This double standard created a situation where sexually experienced men married sexually inexperienced, often terrified, women. For many couples, this led to a relationship that started with shame and confusion rather than joy.